Hello, today we're going to talk about human research and the regulation of it in the United States. We're not going to dig too deeply into it because it's a little bit beyond the scope of this course to go too far. But as an administrator of a healthcare facility, you do need to be familiar with some of the larger concepts. And so we'll cover those. If you want to do a deep dive, as they say, you're welcome to look at the textbook that I co-authored with Faye Rosofsky. Um, but that's a painful read, so let's jump into it. In this discussion, we'll talk about an overview of research regulation. We'll first talk about what is research. We'll discuss some of the primary regulatory structures for research, and we'll talk about some of the principles behind what is ethical and appropriate research, and we'll talk about the basic structure of how a research protocol is structured. What is research? Here is a short version of the definition used by the federal government, which suggests that, would you be interacting with this individual but for the research? That's a little bit incomplete in that certainly in clinical research where you'd be taking care of patients and you might want to be comparing one type of care to another type of care, as you would already be interacting with that individual. Um, it also, the exception is that also research should not be confused with um, innovative care, which is not usually part of a research protocol, but simply the cleverness of the surgeon or the physician in taking care of a patient in a new and innovative way. The exceptions, the major ones, are discussed in your textbook, so we won't dive into those. In Virginia, under the Virginia law, there is a little bit slightly different definition, um, and that is a bit more detailed. Certainly limits its work to human subjects, and that covers a lot of systematic investigation. What are the primary regulatory structures for researching in the United States? Well, the first is what is referred to as the common rule. It's been adopted by most of the federal agencies that fund human research, whether that's the National Institutes of Health, FDA, and even the Department of Defense, Department of Health and Education. Any of the major or any of the federal departments usually require compliance with what's referred to as the common rule. The common rule is currently being rewritten, and so it's yet another reason for us to avoid diving too deep into what the current common rule is, because that is evolving as we speak. In Virginia, to take it as an example of many states, we have what's referred to as the Human Research Act. The distinction is that the common rule only applies to research that is federally funded, or that may apply to institutions that receive federal funding, whereas the Virginia Act refers to any research regardless of the funding source. And so it is much more broad-reaching, though it is much less enforced. If one asked a clinical researcher in Virginia whether Virginia had its own statute, many of them would have no idea that this statute actually exists. So let's dive into the common rule for a moment. Um, as I mentioned, it applies to all institutions that receive federal funds for research. It was a badge of honor some years ago that almost every prominent research program was shut down for not strictly adhering to the common rule requirements. Each institution is required to file an assurance with OHRP that it will comply with the common rule. And like many very detailed regulations, whether it's from CMS or any other federal agency, it is often easy to get crosswise of the common rule. It also generally applies, even though the FDA has a separate code section, to all clinical trials supporting new drug applications. That means any of the data that goes into supporting getting a drug approved by the FDA has to comply with the common rule. The Virginia Human Research Act, as I mentioned, refers to all research performed within the Commonwealth. And to step back a little bit to the prior slide, The common rule and the FDA regulation may apply to any place in the world because any data that's submitted to support a new drug application has to comply with the common rule, regardless of where that research was conducted. The Virginia regulation applies only to the territory of the Commonwealth. It, of course, likes to use a little bit different lingo than what we see in the Federal Act, just to keep it interesting. Whereas under the Federal Act, one would have an IRB, an Institutional Review Board. Here you have a Human Research Review Committee, just to add to your acronyms for cocktail parties. Let's talk a little bit about the ethics in research. Need you to dust off what you learned in the first unit a little bit. After World War II and some of the atrocities that occurred during the war, the Nuremberg Code was drafted as a means of setting forth what the Western countries, certainly the victors of the war, believed to be the appropriate guidelines to control research. The Nuremberg Code came out in 1947. It was focused on the need for informed consent and the favorable risk-benefit analysis to the patient. You'll remember that really harkens back to our autonomy model that we've talked about. 1964, the Declaration of Helsinki came out, and it was amended again in 2000 at Edinburgh. These are from the World Medical Association that again focuses on the favorable risk-benefit analysis and independent review. In 1979, the Belmont Report came out. This is a U.S. document. It was focused on the informed consent and the favorable risk-benefit analysis, as well as protecting vulnerable populations, which was not specifically addressed in the prior documents. The International Ethical Guidelines for Research came out in 1982. They were revised again in 1993. And these are guidelines for performing drug and vaccine trials any place in the world. You will also come across the European community uses a GCP, General Clinical Practices, I believe is the abbreviation. Even I forget all the abbreviations sometimes. That is used to support any clinical trial data that's being provided to European nations. Looking a little bit further, what are the kind of base value ethics that go into whether or not research is ethical? First is, and this comes from an article came out in JAMA in 2000. Lead author is Emmanuel. They put forward this sort of a checklist of bullet points to think about in determining whether research is worthwhile and is ethical. First is value. What is the value of this research? What are we looking for? What benefit will it have? Next, what is the scientific validity? Will the results be valid and verifiable in other studies? Is there a fair selection process for the participants in the study? And that is, are they given informed consent? Are they free to decline to participate in it? Are they selected from a cross section of society that's appropriate for the study? All those things should go into that consideration. Is there a favorable risk-benefit ratio? Are we endangering a patient needlessly to be conducting this research? Is there an independent review process in place for both before we do the protocol and the protocol while it is underway to assure safety of the patient and continued scientific validity and value of the study? Is there informed consent? Do the patients understand what they are enrolling in? Are the subjects being respected? This harkens back to, used to be kind of a rite of passage that all medical students were enrolled in medical studies, whether they liked it or not, as simply part of being enrolled in the medical school. That is done much less these days, but I got to tell you, I really enjoyed the alcohol absorption testing I did in the forensic medicine department. Let's look at how we go about applying the common rule. First, we'll look at the researcher. We'll look at the research protocol. We'll look at the institutional review board and activity during the study. So let's first look at the researcher. What are the credentials for a researcher? And first and foremost is, does the person who's wanting to conduct this research have the appropriate scientific background? Do they have training in research? And by that I mean not only in the science, but in the protocol in the process of documentation of the care and feeding of research subjects, of reporting to IRBs, all those sorts of things that go into complying with the common rule. Nothing can get a facility into more trouble than having a researcher who is not keeping the IRB advised of what's occurring. Has the researcher been blacklisted? And by that I mean, have they been excluded from either participating in federal funded healthcare, or have they been excluded from federally funded research funds because of some event that has occurred in the past? Allowing such a researcher to conduct research in your facility may end up causing your facility to lose all federal funding, which is kind of the kiss of death in healthcare. Will the researcher actually have sufficient involvement in this research? In the good old days, the professor of a department had his name on every research study that was done in the department, whether he knew about it or not. And quite often they were not personally involved in conducting the research, didn't look after the patients, didn't look at the data. They were more interested in being part of the publication. That is not appropriate in current practice and should not be tolerated. Let's look now at the research protocol. It's really kind of a blueprint, a process map, if you will, of how a study is going to be conducted. It is project management for those of you in healthcare administration. The protocol has to, in essence, demonstrate that everything has been thought through in the study, both good events and bad outcomes, what's going to happen if, and all of the contingencies that are in place for all of these steps. It also documents all of the reporting milestones, how the data is going to be analyzed, how the patients are going to be selected, and so forth. It is kind of the who, what, where, and why, and how report to the IRB. It particularly has to include how informed consent is going to be obtained from test subjects, and that is no small feat if you're doing a study, for example, of patients in behavioral health or emergency medicine or other places where sitting down and having a nice one-on-one conversation is not terribly practical. Let's look now at the IRB, and if you're speaking Virginia regulation, it is the Human Research Review Committee, the HRRC. But in essence, the IRB has the purpose of being the soul of the institution, of assuring that researchers are thinking through their research projects, that the research subjects in particular are being protected. The composition of the panel we'll look at the activities of the panel, and we'll look at other details of the IRB. There was a movement, and still is certainly, to have independent companies serve as IRBs. The federal government agency, OHRP, has recommended against that, where it is possible to have a local committee because they want the local community input. They want the familiarity with the local statutes. They want familiarity with the diversity in the community, and they want the institution to really own the decisions of that IRB. It's not to say that it's prohibited, it just is not favored these days. So What is the role of or the purpose of the IRB? As I mentioned before, it is to protect our research participants. Let's look now at the composition of the IRB. Minimum, the IRB must have at least 5 members. At least one of those members must be a physician or scientist in the institution. There also has to be at least one non-scientific member. And in fact, the OHRP encourages that the committee be composed of as diverse of a group as is found in the community. They want to assure that people outside of the institution are participating, that there is a good reflection of the religious and ethnic diversity in the community, as well as gender diversity, and any other mix that may be reflected in the community. On any vote that's taken, at least one non-scientific member has to be there to vote in that process. There is also very strict prohibitions on conflicts of interest, and this often comes up in the institution setting where a member of the IRB may actually be receiving funding for her projects from the same company that's sponsoring a protocol that's being considered. If that is the case, that member must recuse themselves from deliberations on that matter. The key to a successful IRB is really in selecting a strong chairman who will keep the committee working, keep it organized, and above all, keep the documentation in order. Because that's what one is reviewed on by the federal government, is the documentation, as opposed to what interactions may occur. IRB membership is, in most institutions, academic institutions, is a very involved process. They may meet once a week to review proposed studies, ongoing studies, so it really requires quite a large time commitment. What are the activities of the IRB? Well, first, of course, they are involved in the approval of any protocol that would take place within the institution. This may be complex in that a study may be going on at more than one institution, maybe a multi-site process, and they need to be engaged in conversation with other IRBs as to approving a protocol. There must be a continuous review in that you can't just do kind of one and done, say, okay, the protocol is approved, you're all set, tell us when it's done. There has to be an ongoing review of all studies going on in the institution. As I mentioned before, all of the things that go into the qualifications of the researcher have to be reviewed by the IRB. Everything down to the compensation of the subjects, how that study is going to be conducted, down to the details of how informed consent is going to be taken care of, how's transportation going to be provided, what's going to happen if there's an adverse event. All of those things have to be reviewed by the IRB and scrupulously documented as to what everything occurred during that conversation. The research activity itself includes recruiting, includes compensation, includes special populations, as well as adverse events. Last but not least, we'll talk about potential professional liability in research. In recruiting, the IRB is going to be particularly interested in, because the federal government is particularly interested in, how are you going to be recruiting people to join the study, and what does that advertising look like? What incentives are being put out there to find participants? And any of you who have been involved in clinical research will appreciate that enrolling subjects can be very, very challenging because you may be maybe a condition that is very rare. It may be one that has strong emotional overtones to it. It may be a transportations issue that is involved. Lots of challenges to enrolling participants. What are the qualifications for someone to be enrolled in the study? Are those clearly articulated? Are you providing any incentives to staff to be recruiting participants. That is a delicate line of how to go about doing that. Clearly, your frontline staff, whether that's in the ED or nurses on the floor, or outreach staff, all of them may be in a position to be steering enrollees towards your study, but are they using the ethical process to do that? Is the recruitment equitable? Are you recruiting people with appropriately from the appropriate communities, and not over recruiting from some communities? Prison inmates have been overutilized, obviously. Medical students have been overly utilized because there's certainly a risk or certainly some pressure, if not incentive, to participate in clinical trials in both of those groups. In looking at compensation, who's being paid? Is the enrollee being paid? Are their parents being paid? Is the administrator of the institution where the person resides getting paid? All those have to be put forth in the protocol. What are they being paid for? They cannot be paid to take extraordinary risk with their health. They need to be fairly compensated, and that, of course, is an ongoing discussion as to what fair compensation is. What is reasonable? One needs to also be very concerned about special populations, and are they being appropriately protected in studies such as this? For example, if we're doing a study involving the disabled, are we applying pressure to them? Do they knowingly understand and can freely consent to the study? If not, how are we getting surrogate consent, and are we protecting those people from being taken advantage of? I have women listed here, and you think, is it that we need to protect women? No, the answer is that a lot of studies, particularly the first time in man studies, what's referred to as phase 1 studies, have been traditionally conducted on college undergraduates or male medical students, and have excluded women. And so a lot of the FDA data, even through phase 2 and 3, have dealt with men, and we're obviously discovering that women have a little different biology. We're also discovering that ethnic groups, whether that's a white ethnic group or a black ethnic group or a Hispanic ethnic group, all may have different reactions to medications, and so we need to be breaking down our data more and recruiting more people from those groups to be participating in studies, so that we have a better understanding of how medications work. And someone from Asia may react quite differently than someone from Africa to a given medication, and we need to be able to appreciate that. So when we're recruiting, we need to be taking that into consideration. What do we do when we have an adverse event? And this again calls into question that risk-benefit analysis. If there's one adverse event, we chalk it up to, gosh, that was an outlier. But when we start seeing 2, 3, 4, 5, or some percentage of however big your study is, then we need to be thinking about, is the risk-benefit analysis still valid for this study? And so every adverse event has to be documented, and that of course leads to all that interesting information you get with every drug that's advertised on TV, that they all may cause dizziness, they all may cause GI upset and everything else, because all of those things have been recorded as adverse events that have occurred during a study. Are they related? Are they associated? It's not always entirely clear, but they all have to be documented. There has to be an investigation to try to determine whether or not the adverse event is related. Sometimes we never know. We have to document what that determination is of why the adverse events occurred, and we have to keep records of all of the data that we collect. There are patient safety committees that are set up independently, as you'll read about in the book, that may be analyzing data separate and apart from the data analysis group for the study itself. The intent is to have a kind of a third party watching this data to see is the drug hugely successful that we ought to terminate the study early because we're having such great outcomes. We do see that sometimes with some medications. Or should we be terminating this study because the risk-benefit analysis is no longer valid? And so that the need for that documentation, record keeping is vitally important. We'll touch a little bit on professional liability here. We'll obviously take this up further in, I think it's section 7, where we'll talk about medical malpractice liability. But in the research arena, it does come up as to what is the standard of care. You're out there on the cutting edge conducting a study that's never been done before. What is the standard of care for that? And that's where you tend to get into a little bit of academic bravado, in that you may have someone from Harvard who is critiquing someone at Stanford because we'd never do it that way at Harvard, or vice versa. And so that can be a little problematic to determine what the standard of care is in cutting edge research. We do get into the challenge of should the healthcare provider have been providing the accepted therapy, or should they have been providing the experimental protocol for this patient, and why or why not in that process. Obviously, the issue of informed consent continues to be very strong, in that in retrospect, of course, a patient that has an adverse outcome is always going to be thinking, gosh, I wouldn't have consented to that if I knew I was actually going to have this complication. Well, the challenge of doing any research is we wouldn't be doing the research if we knew exactly what all the risk and all the benefits were. Otherwise, we wouldn't need to do the research. The other thing that comes up somewhat in the experimental area, but not entirely, is a term that you'll hear called off-label use. Off-label use is overused in practice. What that really means is that this medication or this product has never been approved by the FDA for marketing for this purpose. It's not to say that it's a bad product or that it is inappropriate to use in this process. It just means that the manufacturer never spent the money and time to have that product approved by the FDA for that purpose. There are a lot of famous examples of this. For example, pedicle screws that are used in spine surgery initially were never approved for that purpose. They were approved for long bone fractures. Smith & Nephew and other manufacturers knew that they were being used off-label, and in fact there were some marketing efforts conducted outside the U.S. for physicians to train them how to use those things, but they were never approved for that purpose. So they were being considered off-label. Off-label may be the standard of care, in that aspirin has never gone through FDA approval, and so therefore any use of aspirin would be considered an off-label use. So don't be too stressed out by someone saying that that's an off-label use. It's merely a term of art. That is the highlights of human research that we're going to cover in this program. I can certainly talk about it for several more days, but I'm sure you have worn thin, so I hope you are at a spot where you can get outside and enjoy the day. And we will be back to talk about another topic.